honorable guests, historians, and esteemed listeners. Today, we gather to discuss one of the most pivotal moments in medieval history, the Battle of Hastings. This single battle changed the course of England's future, altering its leadership, culture, and destiny forever. Throughout history, certain battles have shaped the destiny of nations, altered the course of events, and defined the future of civilizations. One such battle, fought on October 14th, 1066, stands as one of the most significant military confrontations of the medieval era, the Battle of Hastings. This battle was more than just a violent clash between two armies. It was a turning point that led to the transformation of England's political, cultural, and social landscape. To truly understand the importance of this battle, we must first recognize the volatile circumstances that led to it. The year 1066 was marked by uncertainty, ambition, and competing claims to the English throne. The passing of King Edward the Confessor in January of that year left a power vacuum, as he had no direct heir. This lack of clear succession led to multiple contenders vying for control of the kingdom, each with their own claim, alliances, and military strength. The struggle for the throne would culminate in a conflict that would ultimately decide the fate of England for centuries to come. The significance of the Battle of Hastings extends beyond the battlefield itself. It was not just a contest of swords and shields, but a struggle between two different cultures, military strategies, and visions for the future. The battle determined who would rule England, but it also introduced new administrative systems, architectural advancements, and linguistic influences that can still be seen today. This momentous clash was fought between two formidable sides, one seeking to defend their homeland, the other determined to conquer and claim the throne. The warriors who stood on the battlefield that day were not just fighting for victory, they were fighting for the very identity of their nation. As we explore the details of this legendary battle, we must remember that its outcome was not just the result of chance or brute strength, but of strategy, resilience, and the ambitions of those who sought to shape history. The Battle of Hastings did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of years of political intrigue, shifting alliances, and disputed claims to the English throne. To truly understand why this battle was fought, we must first examine the events that led up to it. The heart of the conflict lay in the succession crisis that followed the death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066. Edward had ruled England for over 2 decades, but his reign was marked by a crucial weakness. He had no direct heir. Without a clear successor, the question of who would inherit the throne became a source of immense tension, drawing in powerful rulers from across Europe. Several influential leaders claimed they had a right to rule England, each basing their claim on promises, bloodlines, or previous agreements. One of the key figures in this dispute was the ruler of England at the time, who had been crowned shortly after Edward's death. He was chosen by the English nobility, particularly the Witan, a council of Anglo-Saxon nobles and clergy, and had strong support within the kingdom. However, his ascension to the throne was immediately challenged by two powerful leaders from beyond England's borders, one from Scandinavia and the other from Normandy. The Scandinavian claimant was a fearsome warrior king who believed he had a legitimate claim to the throne due to a past agreement between his predecessor and a former English ruler. He gathered a massive army and launched an invasion in northern England. The English king was forced to march his forces north to defend the kingdom, where he engaged in a brutal battle that ended in victory, but at a great cost. His army, though triumphant, was exhausted from the fierce fighting. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, another ambitious leader was preparing for war. He had long believed that Edward had promised him the English throne and that his right to rule had been stolen. Determined to claim what he saw as rightfully his, he spent months gathering a powerful army, securing the support of allies, and assembling a fleet of ships for an invasion. Unlike the Scandinavian attack, which had been repelled, this new challenger had carefully planned his campaign, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in English history. With the English forces weakened from their recent victory in the north, they now had to march south to face a fresh and well-prepared enemy. The fate of England hung in the balance as these two mighty forces prepared for the confrontation that would change the nation forever. The Battle of Hastings was not just a clash of armies. It was a contest of leadership, strategy, and ambition. At the heart of this conflict stood two remarkable commanders, one defending his homeland, the other seeking to claim a throne he believed was rightfully his. Their decisions, courage, and tactical brilliance would determine the fate of England and leave a lasting legacy in history. On one side was the ruler of England, a seasoned warrior who had spent years defending his kingdom from external threats. He had proven his strength and leadership on the battlefield, earning the loyalty of his warriors. He was a man who understood the value of discipline and had perfected the use of the shield wall, a formidable defensive formation that had served the Anglo-Saxons well in battle for generations. Just weeks before Hastings, he had led his forces to a stunning victory against an invading Scandinavian army in the north, demonstrating his military prowess. However, this victory had come at a cost. His army was fatigued, and many of his best men had been lost in the brutal fighting. Facing him across the battlefield was a determined and ambitious leader from Normandy. He was not only a skilled military commander, but also a shrewd politician, known for his ability to inspire loyalty and command respect. His claim to the English throne was based on an alleged promise made by the late King Edward the Confessor, as well as an oath of loyalty that had supposedly been sworn to him. But he knew that claims and promises meant little without action. To secure his claim, he had spent months meticulously preparing for invasion, building a fleet, gathering an army, and ensuring that his forces were well-equipped and highly trained. His army was composed of well-disciplined cavalry, skilled archers, and experienced infantry, giving him a tactical advantage over the largely foot-soldier-based English army. The two leaders were strikingly different in their backgrounds and approaches to warfare. One was a battle-hardened ruler defending his land with an army of fiercely loyal housecarls and local militia. The other was a determined invader with a professional army, innovative tactics, and a bold vision for conquest. As these two commanders prepared for battle on the morning of October 14th, 1066, they both knew that the outcome would not just decide who wore the English crown, it would shape the future of England itself. Their strategies, leadership, and ability to adapt in the heat of battle would ultimately determine the victor in one of the most decisive confrontations in medieval history. Before the fateful clash at Hastings, both sides spent months preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The battle was not merely an impromptu encounter, but the result of careful planning, military strategy, and logistical efforts. The preparations undertaken by both the English and the Normans played a critical role in determining the outcome of the battle. The English preparations. For the English ruler, war had come suddenly and in two waves. At the beginning of 1066, he had been forced to prepare for multiple threats to his throne, both from Scandinavia and from Normandy. The first major challenge came in September when a massive Viking army invaded northern England. The English king, demonstrating his swift decision-making and military skill, marched his forces northward in an exhausting journey that covered nearly 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. When he reached the battlefield at Stamford Bridge, he led his army to a decisive victory against the invaders, crushing the Scandinavian threat once and for all. However, this victory came at a cost. Many of his most experienced warriors had been lost in battle, and his surviving troops were fatigued from the long march and the brutal fight. As they were still recovering, urgent news arrived. Another invasion had begun, this time from the south. The Normans had landed on the shores of England, and they were advancing inland. Without hesitation, the English king gathered his remaining forces and embarked on another exhausting march, this time southward, to meet the new invaders. Despite these challenges, the English forces were well trained in their traditional method of warfare. Their most effective tactic was the shield wall, a solid defensive formation in which warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, locking their shields together to create an almost impenetrable barrier. This formation had been highly effective in previous battles, allowing the English to withstand enemy attacks and strike back when the time was right. The English army was primarily composed of housecarls and herdsmen. The housecarls were the king's professional warriors, armed with powerful two-handed axes and well-trained in combat. The herdsmen were local militia, made up of farmers and common men called upon to defend their land. While the housecarls were well-armored and experienced, the Fyrdsmen had limited combat training. Still, their loyalty to the king and their determination to defend England made them a formidable force. The Norman preparations. Unlike the English, who had been forced to fight back-to-back battles with little time for rest, the Normans had spent months preparing for their invasion. Their leader had begun assembling his forces long before setting sail for England. He gathered soldiers from across Normandy and even recruited warriors from other parts of Europe, including mercenaries who were skilled in combat. One of the greatest strengths of the Norman army was its diversity in combat tactics. Unlike the English, who primarily fought on foot, the Normans had a well-balanced army that included cavalry, archers, and infantry. The Norman knights were highly trained horsemen, equipped with lances and swords, capable of delivering devastating charges against enemy formations. Their archers, armed with longbows, could weaken enemy lines before the main attack even began. This combination of troops gave the Normans a strategic advantage, as they could adapt their tactics depending on how the battle unfolded. To support this invasion, the Normans had also built a fleet of ships capable of transporting thousands of men, horses, and supplies across the English Channel. Their leader had carefully timed the invasion, waiting for the right weather conditions before setting sail. When the Normans landed on the southern coast of England, they did not immediately march to battle. Instead, they strategically secured their position, built defensive fortifications, and began raiding nearby settlements to weaken English morale and supply lines. While the English king had to rush his exhausted army into battle, the Normans had the advantage of being well-rested, well-supplied, and fully prepared for war. Their leader had studied English battle tactics and knew that the shield wall would be difficult to break, but he also had a plan to counter it. With both sides now ready, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in English history. The warriors of both armies stood ready, knowing that the coming battle would determine the fate of England for generations to come. The morning of October 14th, 1066, dawned over the fields near Hastings. The English and Norman armies had spent the night preparing for battle, each side knowing that the fate of England hung in the balance. As the sun rose, the two forces took their positions, and one of the most significant battles in medieval history was about to unfold. The English position, defending the high ground. The English army, led by their king, had arrived at Senlac Hill, near modern-day Battle, East Sussex, just days before. Though his forces were weary from their rapid march south after their victory in the north, the king had chosen a strong defensive position. The hill provided a natural advantage, giving the English forces a commanding view of the battlefield and making it difficult for the Normans to attack uphill. The English soldiers formed their battle lines at the top of the hill in a shield wall formation, their most trusted defensive strategy. This tactic involved warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, interlocking their shields to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. Armed with axes, spears, and swords, the English warriors were prepared to hold their ground against the invaders. The core of the English army consisted of two types of soldiers, the housecarls and the Fyrdsmen. The housecarls were elite warriors, well-trained and heavily armored, carrying large two-handed axes capable of cutting through enemy armor. The Fyrdsmen, on the other hand, were local militia, farmers, craftsmen, and common men called to defend their land. While they lacked the training and equipment of professional soldiers, their determination to protect England gave them incredible resolve. The Norman position, a well-equipped invasion force. At the foot of the hill, the Norman leader arranged his army in 3 divisions. The archers in the front line, these skilled bowmen were tasked with softening the English defenses before the main assault. The infantry in the middle, these foot soldiers carried swords and spears, ready to charge into battle once the enemy's defenses were weakened. The cavalry in the rear, the Norman knights, mounted on powerful war horses, were the elite force of the army. Unlike the English, who fought mostly on foot, the Norman cavalry was trained to charge at high speed, breaking enemy lines with the force of their lances. The Norman leader had one key challenge. His army had to fight uphill against a well-entrenched enemy. He knew that a direct charge would be difficult, as the shield wall was an incredibly strong formation. But he also had confidence in his army's discipline and flexibility. The first attack, the Norman archers and infantry. The battle began with the Normans launching volleys of arrows toward the English shield wall. However, because of the angle of the hill and the tight formation of the English warriors, many arrows either bounced off shields or missed their targets. The English warriors stood firm, holding their position and refusing to break ranks. Seeing that the archery attack had little effect, the Norman infantry advanced up the hill. They clashed with the English defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat, but the shield wall proved too strong. The English warriors, using their axes and spears, struck down the attackers as they struggled to climb the slope. The Norman cavalry was then called in to break through the shield wall. Knights on horseback charged up the hill, their lances and swords flashing in the sunlight. But the steep terrain worked against them. Horses struggled to maintain their speed, and the tightly packed English defenders held their ground. The Norman cavalry, unable to smash through the English lines, was forced to retreat. The first phase of the battle had ended, and the English were still standing strong. However, the Normans were not finished. Their leader was a master strategist, and he was about to change the course of the battle using tactics that would prove decisive. As the Battle of Hastings raged on, it became clear that the Normans were facing a formidable challenge. The English shield wall had proven nearly impenetrable, repelling wave after wave of Norman infantry and cavalry. The steep incline of Senlac Hill gave the English an advantage, as the Normans had to fight uphill, making their attacks less effective. Despite their initial failures, the Normans were not ready to concede defeat. Their leader was not just a skilled warrior, but also a brilliant strategist, and he quickly realized that brute force alone would not win the battle. Observing the battlefield, he recognized that the English were disciplined, but also highly reactive. They were trained to hold their ground, but if an opportunity for an attack presented itself, they would instinctively pursue retreating enemies. The Norman leader decided to use this to his advantage by employing one of the most famous battlefield strategies of the medieval period, the feigned retreat. The feigned retreat, luring the English out of formation. The feigned retreat was a deceptive maneuver in which troops would pretend to flee in panic, tricking the enemy into breaking formation and pursuing them. If executed correctly, it could create gaps in the enemy's defenses, making them vulnerable to counterattacks. The Norman leader ordered his cavalry to simulate a retreat, acting as if they were fleeing in disarray. Seeing the Normans appear to run away, a portion of the English warriors, eager to press their advantage, broke ranks and pursued them down the hill. This was exactly what the Normans had hoped for. As soon as the English soldiers left their defensive positions, the Norman cavalry suddenly turned around and launched a devastating counterattack. The scattered English troops, now out in the open, were quickly overwhelmed by the swift and well-organized Norman horsemen. One by one, the English warriors who had pursued the retreating enemy were cut down, weakening their overall defensive strength. Encouraged by the success of this maneuver, the Normans repeated the tactic multiple times throughout the battle. Each time, more English warriors were drawn out of their shield wall, creating more gaps in their once solid defense. The Normans took full advantage of these breaches, sending in their cavalry and infantry to exploit the openings and push further into English lines. Archers and combined attacks, the gradual weakening of the shield wall. In addition to the feigned retreat, the Normans also adjusted their use of archers. Early in the battle, their arrows had been ineffective due to the steep angle of the hill and the strength of the English shields. However, as the battle progressed and the shield wall began to weaken, the Norman leader ordered his archers to aim higher, sending arrows in high, arching trajectories to rain down on the English forces from above. This new tactic proved far more effective, as the English warriors could no longer rely solely on their shields for protection. With the English army now under increasing pressure from multiple sides, exhaustion and disorder began to set in. They had been fighting for hours, and while their shield wall had held strong in the early stages, it was no longer as impenetrable as before. The combination of repeated cavalry charges, relentless infantry assaults, and well-aimed arrow fire slowly wore them down. The Norman leader's adaptability and tactical intelligence had turned the tide of the battle. What had begun as a difficult uphill struggle was now shifting in favor of the Normans. The English, though still fighting bravely, were beginning to lose their advantage. The battle was reaching a critical turning point, and the final phase of the confrontation was about to unfold. As the sun began to set over the battlefield, the fate of England teetered on the edge of a knife. For hours, the English warriors had stood their ground atop Senlac Hill, resisting relentless Norman assaults. Their shield wall, a fortress of interlocked shields and unwavering discipline, had endured wave after wave of attacks. However, no army, no matter how determined, could fight indefinitely. Fatigue was setting in, and the once impenetrable English defense was beginning to show signs of weakness. The long battle, fatigue, and attrition. The Battle of Hastings was unusually long for a medieval conflict. Most battles of the time lasted only a few hours, but this engagement had dragged on from early morning until late afternoon. The English warriors had already endured a grueling march south from Stamford Bridge, where they had fought another intense battle just days before. Unlike the Normans, who had fresh troops and a well-planned supply chain, the English were running low on energy, food, and even weapons. Their arms ached from swinging heavy axes and swords, their shields bore the scars of countless blows, and their legs struggled to keep them standing. On the other hand, the Normans, despite their initial setbacks, had the advantage of tactical flexibility. Their leader had carefully rotated his forces, allowing his soldiers to rest while fresh troops took their place on the front lines. This strategy ensured that the Normans could sustain their attacks while the English, who had no reinforcements, had no choice but to keep fighting without respite. The shield wall weakens. The combination of feigned retreats, cavalry charges, and archer fire had chipped away at the once solid English formation. Every time the English warriors broke ranks to pursue retreating Normans, their defensive line became thinner and weaker. Though their leader ordered them to hold firm, the prolonged battle and repeated assaults made discipline difficult to maintain. By the afternoon, several sections of the shield wall had been breached. The Norman cavalry, seizing the opportunity, surged through these gaps, striking down the exposed English soldiers. The once organized defense now began to unravel, with small groups of English warriors fighting desperately but no longer as a unified force. Confusion and misinformation on the battlefield. Another factor that contributed to the turning point was battlefield confusion. In the chaos of combat, it became increasingly difficult for the English to communicate effectively. The noise of clashing weapons, the screams of the wounded, and the dust kicked up by the fighting made it almost impossible for commands to be heard across the battlefield. At one crucial moment, a false rumor spread among the Norman troops that their leader had been killed. This momentarily caused panic among the Normans, as many believed the battle was lost. However, their leader, realizing the danger of this misinformation, lifted his helmet to reveal his face, shouting to his men that he was still alive and leading the charge. This act reinvigorated the Norman forces, who redoubled their efforts with renewed determination. In contrast, the English did not have the same advantage. Their leader had remained in the thick of battle, fighting alongside his warriors, but as the shield wall collapsed, he became increasingly vulnerable. His presence had been a source of inspiration for his troops, and as the fighting grew more chaotic, his survival became the key to holding the remaining English forces together. With their defenses breaking, their strength fading, and the Normans pressing their advantage, the English found themselves in the most dangerous phase of the battle. The once unbreakable shield wall was now shattered in places, and the final moments of the confrontation were drawing near. The question was no longer whether the English could hold their ground. It was whether they could survive the onslaught that was about to come. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows over the blood-soaked battlefield, the English forces found themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. Their once mighty shield wall, which had withstood wave after wave of Norman attacks throughout the day, was now broken in multiple places. The air was thick with the cries of wounded men, the clash of steel, and the thunder of galloping horses as the Norman cavalry surged forward to deliver the final, decisive blow. The collapse of the shield wall. For hours, the English had fought with unyielding determination, but exhaustion had finally taken its toll. The Normans, employing a combination of feigned retreats, archery barrages, and cavalry charges, had steadily worn down the English defenses. The once disciplined ranks of housecarls and herdsmen were now fragmented, with isolated groups of warriors fighting desperately in the fading light. The Norman archers, having adjusted their strategy, now launched arrows in high arcs, raining them down upon the weary English troops. With many gaps in their formation and their shields no longer held up as firmly as before, the English suffered increasing casualties. Some warriors, too fatigued to lift their heavy shields, fell where they stood. Others attempted to regroup, only to be cut down by Norman swordsmen and knights who now poured through the breaches in the English lines. The Norman cavalry, which had struggled in the early hours of the battle due to the steep incline of Senlac Hill, now found the English in a vulnerable and exposed state. Without a unified defensive line to stop them, the knights charged into the heart of the remaining English troops, cutting them down with their lances and swords. The housecarls, still fighting valiantly, swung their massive two-handed axes with deadly force, but their numbers had dwindled, and their once solid defensive formation was now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. The English king's last stand. Amidst the chaos, the English king still stood his ground, surrounded by his most loyal warriors. Unlike many rulers who commanded their armies from the rear, he had fought alongside his men throughout the battle, inspiring them with his courage and determination. His banner still flew above the battlefield, a rallying point for those who refused to surrender. But as the Normans pressed their advantage, the situation became increasingly dire. The English warriors around him fought with unbreakable resolve, determined to protect their king at all costs. However, the sheer number of Norman attackers proved overwhelming. One by one, the housecarls fell, their heavy armor and shields offering little protection against the relentless barrage of Norman attacks. Then, in a moment that would be remembered for centuries, the English king was struck down. Some accounts claim he was hit by an arrow, piercing him through the eye, a fatal blow that sent shockwaves through his army. Others suggest he was cut down by Norman knights in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Regardless of how he fell, his death marked the beginning of the end for the English resistance. The aftermath on the battlefield. As word spread that their king had fallen, many of the remaining English warriors lost hope. Without their leader, their will to fight collapsed. Some fled the battlefield, while others made a final, desperate stand, fighting to the death rather than surrender. The Normans, sensing victory, pursued the fleeing English, cutting down any who attempted to escape. The battlefield was now littered with the bodies of thousands of fallen warriors, housecarls, herdsmen, Normans, and Saxons alike. The once green slopes of Senlac Hill were stained red with blood, and the sound of battle was slowly replaced by the moans of the wounded and the triumphant shouts of the Norman victors. With the English forces shattered and their king slain, the Normans had secured control of the battlefield. However, the battle's outcome was not just about military victory, it signified the beginning of a new era for England. The struggle for the English crown had been decided, but the consequences of this historic clash would reshape the future of the kingdom for generations to come. As the echoes of battle faded and the last rays of the October sun cast their dim light over the battlefield, the scene at Senlac Hill was one of utter devastation. Thousands of warriors, both English and Norman, lay dead or dying, their bodies scattered across the blood-soaked ground. The English, once standing resolute behind their mighty shield wall, had been utterly defeated. Their leader had fallen, their forces had scattered, and the fate of England now rested in the hands of the victorious Normans. The English retreat, a broken army. With the fall of their king, the remaining English forces lost any hope of turning the tide. The housecarls, his elite warriors, had fought to the last man in a final act of loyalty and defiance, but the herdsmen, exhausted, terrified, and leaderless, began to flee. Some ran toward the nearby forests, hoping to escape the pursuing Norman cavalry. Others, unable to run, simply dropped their weapons and surrendered. The Normans, now in complete control of the battlefield, continued their pursuit of the fleeing English troops. Their cavalry, which had struggled against the English shield wall earlier in the day, now swept across the battlefield with ease, cutting down any who tried to escape. The once mighty army that had defended England had been shattered, and the survivors who escaped knew that their kingdom was forever changed. The death of a generation, the cost of battle. The casualties from the Battle of Hastings were immense. While exact numbers are unknown, it is estimated that thousands of English and Norman warriors perished in the fight. The English had lost many of their best soldiers, housecarls, thanes, noble warriors, and lords who had fought alongside their king. The Norman forces, though victorious, had also suffered significant losses, with countless knights, infantrymen, and archers among the dead. With the battlefield at Senlac Hill behind them, the Normans turned their eyes toward the greatest prize of all, London. The battle had been won, but the conquest of England was not yet complete. Though the English king had fallen and his army had been shattered, the kingdom itself had not yet submitted. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, as the Normans now had to navigate not just the physical journey to the English capital, but also the political and military challenges that lay ahead. The immediate aftermath, restoring order in the ranks. Despite their triumph at Hastings, the Norman forces were exhausted and battle-worn. Many soldiers had fought for hours without rest, their armor dented, and their weapons dulled from the fierce combat. Some knights had lost their horses in battle, and even the victors bore deep wounds from the day's struggle. Before they could march on London, the Norman leader ordered his army to regroup, tend to the wounded, and gather supplies from the surrounding countryside. Looting was rampant as Norman soldiers ransacked the abandoned English camps, taking whatever food, weapons, and valuables they could find. The fallen English warriors, many of whom were noblemen and elite housecarls, were stripped of their armor and possessions. The battlefield became a grim scene of both mourning and plunder, with scavengers, both Norman and local peasants, searching through the remains of the fallen. One of the most immediate concerns for the Norman leader was securing the loyalty of his own troops. Though he had led them to victory, many of his men had followed him across the English Channel with the promise of land and wealth. Now that the battle had been won, he needed to ensure that his army remained disciplined and focused on the larger goal, the complete takeover of England. The English resistance, a kingdom without a king. Although the English king had been slain at Hastings, England was not without leaders. The remaining Anglo-Saxon lords, particularly the powerful earls of Mercia and Northumbria, were still alive and had the potential to rally resistance. There was even talk among the English nobility of crowning another king, possibly one of the late king's relatives or another noble with a strong claim to the throne. News of the Norman victory spread quickly, and as it reached London, panic and uncertainty gripped the city. The English people knew that their king had fallen, but many still hoped that a new leader would rise to oppose the invaders. The surviving members of the English court gathered in London, desperately debating their next move. Some argued for immediate surrender, fearing that resistance would only lead to more bloodshed. Others called for continued defiance, believing that they could raise a new army to repel the Normans before they reached the capital. But the reality was grim. The English had already lost many of their best warriors at Hastings. The nobility was divided, and without a strong leader to unify them, organized resistance seemed unlikely. The Norman strategy, a calculated advance. Understanding that England was not yet fully under his control, the Norman leader did not march directly to London. Instead, he took a more strategic approach. He and his forces moved slowly, securing key towns and fortresses along the way. This methodical advance served two purposes: to cut off any potential resistance before it could organize. By seizing strategic locations, the Normans ensured that no rival English leader could gather troops or supplies for a counterattack. To intimidate the English people into submission, the Normans made a show of their power, burning villages and plundering towns that refused to submit. This display of force sent a clear message: resisting the Normans would only bring destruction. Along the way, Norman soldiers took control of vital roads, castles, and river crossings, ensuring that London would be isolated by the time they arrived. Any English lords who still considered fighting back found themselves increasingly trapped, with nowhere to turn for reinforcements. At the same time, the Norman leader also used diplomacy to gain support from those who might be persuaded to join him rather than resist. Some English nobles, realizing that further defiance would be futile, swore loyalty to him in exchange for keeping their lands and titles. Others, especially those who had lost favor under the previous English king, saw an opportunity to improve their standing under Norman rule. The growing fear in London. As the Norman army drew closer, the mood in London grew more desperate. The English people, once confident in their shield wall and their king, now faced the terrifying reality of conquest. Stories of Norman brutality, of villages burned, of those who resisted being slaughtered, spread throughout the city, sowing fear and uncertainty. The remaining English nobles debated their options. Some were still determined to fight, believing that the city's defenses could hold against the Normans. Others, however, began to waver, questioning whether it was worth risking the complete destruction of London for a lost cause. The Norman leader knew that he did not necessarily need to take London by force. If he could pressure the English nobility into surrendering, he could take the throne without a costly siege. The march to London was not just a military campaign, it was a psychological battle, one that would determine whether England would submit or resist. The conquest of England was not yet complete, but the path to power was becoming clearer. London stood as the final obstacle, and soon, the fate of the kingdom would be decided. As the Norman forces advanced toward London, the fate of England hung in the balance. The great city, the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, was the last stronghold of resistance. If London fell, the conquest would be complete. However, if the English lords and citizens chose to fight, the Normans would have to engage in another brutal battle to claim the throne. The outcome was uncertain, and both sides understood that whatever happened next would determine the future of England. The fear and chaos in London. In the days following the Battle of Hastings, London was a city in turmoil. The news of the king's death had arrived quickly, and with it came fear, confusion, and desperate discussions about what should be done. The remaining English nobility, including powerful earls and church leaders, met in a frantic council to decide their next move. They had a few options: crown a new king and continue the fight. Some nobles believed that they could still resist the Normans by appointing another leader, possibly one of the late king's relatives or another noble with royal blood. There was even talk of making Edgar Atheling, the teenage heir to the throne, the new king. However, Edgar was young, inexperienced, and lacked military support. Prepare the city for a siege. London had strong walls and was well defended, with soldiers, supplies, and a determined population willing to fight. Some nobles argued that they could withstand a Norman attack and force the enemy to retreat. Surrender to the Normans. Others believed that further resistance was futile. The Norman army was strong, well-organized, and had already proven its superiority in battle. A siege would likely result in massive destruction, starvation, and death. Surrendering, while humiliating, could at least spare London from total devastation. The people of London were also divided. Many citizens were loyal to the fallen king and wanted revenge for his death. However, others feared the Normans and worried about what would happen to their families, homes, and livelihoods if war came to the city's gates. The uncertainty made the situation even more tense. The Norman approach, intimidation, and strategy. Unlike at Hastings, where the Normans had faced a determined enemy on the battlefield, the conquest of London required a different approach. The Norman leader knew that marching into the city and launching a direct assault would be costly and dangerous. London was a large, well-fortified city, and even with his skilled cavalry and archers, a prolonged siege could be disastrous. Instead, he used a combination of military pressure, strategic attacks, and psychological warfare to force the English to surrender without a major battle. As the Normans advanced, they systematically cut off London from the rest of the country. They captured key towns, fortresses, and river crossings, ensuring that no reinforcements or supplies could reach the city. The Normans also burned villages and raided surrounding lands, spreading terror among the English and demonstrating what would happen if they resisted. Every village that surrendered was spared, but those that fought back were destroyed, a clear message to London about what was to come. At the same time, the Norman leader sent envoys to the English nobles and clergy, offering them a choice: submit peacefully and retain their lands and positions, or resist and face destruction. Some of the English lords, recognizing the inevitable, began negotiating with the Normans in secret, seeking to preserve their power under the new regime. Others held out, still hoping for a miracle. The final decision, England's fate sealed. As Norman forces moved closer, the morale inside London began to break. The remaining English nobles saw that resistance was becoming impossible. The army that had once defended England was scattered and defeated. The people of London, though angry and fearful, were not willing to see their city destroyed in a futile fight. By December, after weeks of pressure, intimidation, and political maneuvering, the English lords made their decision. They would surrender. The remaining nobles, including Edgar Atheling, church leaders, and city officials, formally submitted to the Norman leader. This marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England. With London surrendering, the road was now clear for the Norman leader to claim the throne. The conquest was nearly complete, but his rule was not yet secure. Now, the real challenge would begin, establishing control over a divided and conquered land. With the surrender of London and the submission of the remaining English lords, the path to the throne was finally clear. However, military conquest alone was not enough. To solidify his rule, the Norman leader had to be formally crowned as the new king of England. Only then would his claim be recognized, not just by the people of England, but also by the rest of Europe. The coronation was more than a ceremony. It was a statement of power, legitimacy, and the beginning of a new era. The preparation for the coronation. The English people, though defeated, still held on to their traditions, and the coronation had to follow their customs to be seen as legitimate. The Norman leader understood the importance of ceremony and symbolism, and he carefully planned his coronation to ensure that it would be recognized by both the English and the Normans as the official transfer of power. The location chosen for the event was Westminster Abbey, one of the most sacred sites in England. This was significant because it was the same place where previous English kings had been crowned. By holding the ceremony there, the Norman leader was sending a clear message. He was not just a foreign conqueror, he was now the rightful ruler of England. To further reinforce his legitimacy, he sought the blessing of the English clergy, particularly the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful religious figure in England. The church played a crucial role in medieval politics, and having the support of the clergy would help ease the transition from Anglo-Saxon to Norman rule. However, tensions were high. The English people had lost their king, their army, and their independence. While some nobles had submitted to the Normans, many English citizens remained hostile. The Norman leader knew that any sign of weakness during the coronation could lead to rebellion, so he ordered his soldiers to be stationed throughout London and around Westminster Abbey to maintain order. The coronation ceremony, a day of power and fear. On Christmas Day, 1066, the long-anticipated coronation took place. The grand halls of Westminster Abbey were filled with Norman knights, English nobles, bishops, and high-ranking officials. The atmosphere was tense. Many Englishmen resented the presence of the Normans, while the Normans themselves remained on high alert, knowing that resistance could still arise. As the ceremony began, the Archbishop of Canterbury led the sacred rites, anointing the Norman leader with holy oil, a divine blessing that signified his authority as God's chosen ruler. This was an important part of medieval coronations, as it reinforced the belief that kings ruled by divine right, not just by force. Then came the most symbolic moment of the ceremony. As the Archbishop placed the crown upon his head and proclaimed him King of England, the gathered crowd erupted into a loud cheer, as was customary for coronations. However, this sudden outburst of noise caused panic among the Norman guards stationed outside the abbey. Fearing that the English had started a rebellion inside the church, the Norman soldiers reacted with violence. They rushed into the streets, attacking civilians and setting nearby buildings on fire. The sounds of shouting, clashing steel, and burning would fill the air, turning what should have been a moment of triumph into a chaotic scene of destruction. Inside the abbey, the newly crowned king and his court remained on edge. Though the coronation had gone as planned, the fear and distrust between the English and the Normans were now more evident than ever. Even as he sat on the throne, his rule was far from secure. The challenges of ruling a conquered land. With a crown now upon his head, the Norman king faced the daunting task of ruling a land that had only recently been his enemy. Unlike his previous victories on the battlefield, the real challenge was now one of governance, control, and legitimacy. The English people had not forgotten their fallen king, and many resented the Norman rule. Though the nobles had submitted, the common people still viewed the Normans as foreign invaders. There were whispers of rebellion in the countryside, and some lords who had submitted under pressure were still looking for an opportunity to reclaim their lands. The new king now had to decide how to secure his rule, how to deal with the remaining English resistance, and how to establish his own dynasty in a foreign land that was still filled with enemies. The Battle of Hastings had been won, but the true battle for England's future had only just begun.